I'm Mike O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow at Brookings. I've been here 24 years, partly because they haven't figured out how to get rid of me yet. The phrase defense burden sharing often gets boiled down to what percent of your nation's GDP or gross domestic product do you devote to military spending. But that is, of course, a pretty simplistic and unidimensional way of thinking about it. More broadly, it's just, are you contributing your fair share, and are your allies doing the same thing? Clearly, the most important way in which sacrifice is shared is in willingness to take casualties. And so if one country in an alliance were doing all the fighting and everyone else were paying for it, that could make some financial burden sharing sense, but it wouldn't really have a moral bond or a tie or fairness at a deeper level. But nonetheless, most commonly when we talk about burden sharing in today's world, it is what percent of your overall GDP do you spend on your nation's armed forces. The main thing President Trump gets right about allied burden sharing, or lack of burden sharing, is that it's really not adequate. And at this point, if we look around at major American allies, we have a number in different parts of the world. Often this debate gets brought to home in regard to NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization now has 29 members, and it has an official goal that everyone should spend 2% of their GDP on their armed forces. The United States right now spends about 3.5%. And so we are not only far and away the biggest in actual dollar equivalent terms, but even when you adjust for the size, the larger size of our country, we are far and away the biggest within NATO in terms of percent of GDP. Other countries, with the exception of a few, Poland, Britain's pretty close, I think Estonia is pretty close, a couple others. Most other NATO allies are in the range of 1 to 1.5% of GDP, which is officially considered inadequate and which has been the basis of debate and complaint from the United States for many years, going back well before the Trump administration. So Donald Trump is in a long tradition of American critics of European and Canadian efforts to do their fair share. There are a few things I think President Trump gets wrong. First of all, you got to step back and say, this alliance is pretty good for the United States in the sense that even if we're doing more than our fair share, who wants to go back to a Europe like what existed before World War I and World War II, where all the different major countries are jostling for position, competing with themselves, potentially forming alliances against each other, and therefore potentially running a higher risk of war in which the United States could ultimately get dragged? That's a far worse situation than a NATO alliance in which different countries do more or less than their fair share. So I think you should take a broader view in historical terms and recognize that having this kind of a powerful alliance with most of the major economies on Earth now in NATO is really stabilizing for international order. And we do get a fair amount of help. For example, in Afghanistan, we had up to 35,000 NATO troops helping us at any given time at the peak level of effort roughly a decade ago. That's nothing to sneeze at. In many ways, this alliance is historically very important, even if the United States is doing a bit more than its share. And to jeopardize the alliance because of debates about burden sharing would probably be a huge mistake. Generally speaking, I think President Trump's been wrong about South Korea. South Korea has often been in the news the last year and a half for obvious reasons. The North Korean threat is serious. We don't really know where the Singapore summit of this year between President Trump and Chairman Kim is going to go, whether we'll ever get to a denuclearization deal. And sometimes President Trump has been skeptical or critical of our South Korean allies. I think they are a remarkable ally. They spend more than 2.5% of their GDP on their military. Of course, they should, because they're facing a very serious threat just to their north. And if they weren't taking it seriously, it's pretty hard to see why we should. Most of the other countries in NATO, the threats are a little bit more abstract or hypothetical, or at least far away at this point. And so I think it's only appropriate that South Korea would be one of our more generous and more resolute alliance partners, but they are. They have been doing a pretty good job of preparing their military over the years, and today they're much better than the North Korean military. And so I think we need to recognize they are a strong partner, not only in Korea, but around the world. They've often deployed in support of operations that we've done elsewhere. And that's one alliance where I would want to put in a strong word of support.